Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. So I was involved in a streaming event. I mean, I don't know if you'd call it an event per se, as more of a premiere live stream of the forthcoming competitive multiplayer FPS Lawbreakers by Boss Key Productions. Now, this is a game that's being headed up by Cliffy B, of course, known from Unreal Tournament as well as Gears of War. And it is a competitive class-based shooter. Now, I thought I'd film all of the footage from last night, put it up in higher resolution, show you a little bit of the game, and give you a few more opinions. Now, I gave a very short opinion on this game when I played it at PAX, because really I only got to play a couple of rounds of it. Now I've played, more like 2 hours of it. There's a couple more things I'd like to say, some more feedback that I'd like to give, and also talk about its place in the market, because I have no doubt, in fact I already know this, because certain websites are writing it as such, and this is the narrative they're attempting to craft, and this is the narrative that I fully intend to stamp on, that it is similar to Overwatch in some way, that it is directly competing with Overwatch, and to some extent, that is true, because you're talking about another multiplayer shooter, multiplayer-only shooter, that has a price up front. So it puts it in the same sort of market space, but it's definitely not the same kind of game, and I don't think it'll appeal to the same sort of people either. So to give a brief synopsis of it, since I already covered basically what it is in my Avaganda video from PAX, Lawbreakers is a competitive class-based shooter, and the mode that we have available at the moment is a mode called Overcharge, in which you have to capture a battery. Takes a few seconds to pick the battery up because you have to drain the battery shields in order to move it. You then take the battery, put it on your back, take it to your generator and start to charge it. Once it charges up to 100%, the enemy team has about 20 seconds to steal the battery back, otherwise you win the game. So it is a capture the flag style scenario with a couple of little twists here and there. There are 2 more modes that have yet to be revealed, but that's the one that we got to play both at PAX and in this demonstration build, and it also included 4 character classes. Now, there is going to be at least 5, that we know for certain. As to how many more there will be, not sure, honestly, at this point. Now, the first thing to note about the class-based system in this game is that the classes don't really synergize with each other in any way. And that's a key difference between a game like this and, say, Overwatch. You have a situation where you can pretty much go toe-to-toe with anybody in a relatively even matchup, assuming you're good enough. That is not the case in Overwatch. Overwatch has this idea of matchups in the same way that, say, a fighting game does, where various characters have a better chance of beating certain other characters, assuming that both players have a similarly high skill level. But in Overwatch, it's far more severe than that. It's very difficult for a character like, say, Symmetra to win a fight with Roadhog, for instance. There are some characters in Overwatch that are just flat out not great at 1v1 combat, or characters that are countered directly by other characters. This isn't the case in Lawbreakers, and the fact that Lawbreakers is a team-based game seems like it's simply the necessity of the game mode, rather than any kind of core aspect of the design. Something like Overwatch, or even something like Battleborn, despite them not really being the same game, still have this big team reliance. They still have this class synergy reliance. They still have the Holy Trinity: healer, tank, DPS. Now, both of those games feature that. Lawbreakers does not. It does have a variance in terms of how tough certain character classes are. Quite a large variance, in fact. For instance, the assassin-type character that you're seeing on the screen right now has 250 health, so she's the squishiest character in the game so far. Whereas, the character with the rocket launcher and the Tesla gun has 500 HP, which is, of course, double that of the assassin character. That said, she is way slower, way less mobile, and in terms of the power of her weapons, they're fundamentally different. Not necessarily weaker, but fundamentally different in terms of the distance at which combat can optimally occur and the situations in which she will excel. But both characters are very easily able to kill each other. Not only that, but they will kill each other without the help of anybody else. Obviously, it helps if somebody's back throwing bullets into the fight on your behalf, no doubt about that, but they're not going to be doing something like healing you or providing you a buff or a shield or something like that. It is, for all intents and purposes, a team deathmatch scenario, despite the fact that the mode really isn't that. As a result, the game gives something more of an arena shooter feel as opposed to these new class-based hero shooters. And I say new, knowing full well that Team Fortress 2 exists and has a similar issue when it comes to matchups, but I think Overwatch and Battleborn dialed that up even higher, taking influence from games such as Dota and League of Legends as opposed to Quake. Lawbreakers doesn't go down that path, and that in itself is a big differentiation, and it's something that I think that people will really enjoy if the Overwatch style of hero shooter does not appeal to them. If this idea of picking a class that can be easily countered by another class that you know you'll almost never beat in a 1v1 situation is distasteful to them. Both games are shooters, but it almost feels like one is more of a shooter than the other, simply because it adheres to older values of the genre. That's not to say that games that don't have any value. I mean, God's sake, I love Overwatch, but there's a reason as to why Lawbreakers is designed in this particular way, because it doesn't want to be like that. The addition of classes does not make the two games all that similar. Rather, it simply provides different playstyles that are all, at least if properly balanced, equally competitive with each other. So let's talk about the class variety currently available. I'd say that it's currently one of the weaknesses of the alpha, and bear in mind this is an alpha. I think for the game to succeed, it is certainly going to either have more classes available, or it's going to have more loadouts available for said classes. As it stands, there are 4 classes, and they all have a loadout which consists of 2 weapons. Usually these weapons have alt fire modes, sometimes they don't, and they'll also be equipped with a couple of different abilities and a ultimate, which is on a timed cooldown. Since we're looking at the assassin, we'll talk a little bit about that first. She's a character that has dual blades, which can be used in melee. Very effective, extremely high damage. You can kill people very quickly with it. The alt attack on that is very interesting because it's a grappling hook of sorts, which allows you to swing and gain a huge amount of momentum. You can traverse the level faster than anybody else. You can close in on an enemy much quicker than anybody else. There's a lot of different tricks you can pull off, and it's kind of necessary because this character is incredibly fragile and tends to die very quickly if she gets caught out in the open. Her secondary weapon is a shotgun. It has 2 fire modes, a regular fire mode, which will fire a burst of a few rounds. You can fire that 3 times before a quick reload. Alternatively, there is a charged shot, which is exactly what it sounds like. Otherwise, abilities-wise, she can do a dash, she can throw down a pulse grenade, which will disable enemy abilities for a short time, also has a knockback, and her ultimate ability is a frenzy, which shows enemies on the map and also gives you health regeneration on hit. This is what people that play Dota and League of Legends might refer to as a kit. Couple of weapons, couple of different abilities, the things that define the character alongside their HP and overall movement speed, and there is a significant difference from class to class in terms of their overall movement speed, whereas actually in a game like Overwatch, there really isn't. You might not know this, but the vast majority of Overwatch characters actually move at exactly the same speed. There are very few exceptions to that. Now, if you want a stark contrast to the assassin, you need only look at Bombshell, who seems to be a female version of the character that we played at PAX. I do not recall, in fact, I'm almost certain that this particular character was not female when I played her. I don't know if they've decided to change the gender, or if they're going to give gender choices for all the characters, which I think would be pretty cool, assuming that you can keep the silhouettes relatively similar to make sure that target identification is not that tricky. She has an identical kit to the masked character that I was playing at PAX, and that consists of a rocket launcher, which is exactly what it sounds like, a Tesla gun, which is a short-ranged dangerous weapon that does consistent damage. Neither of these weapons have alt fire on this character. She can also do a ground pound, and she's able to throw out a neutron mine. Her ultimate involves her basically going full dark side, floating in the air, and firing lightning from her hands, which is about as enjoyable as it sounds. She has 500 HP, and she does not move that fast at all. She's the slowest moving character in the game. Doesn't really have a great movement ability. The ground pound could be considered one, but it's not really that ideal. So that's a sort of stark comparison between those two characters. They can clearly fight each other, but obviously if the assassin gets caught at range, then she's probably toast. But if you catch Bombshell with her rocket launcher out, say, from behind with the knives, chances are she's not going to be able to switch out to her Tesla cannon and kill you before you kill her. Key difference. Cool, so we talked a little bit about the classes, and as I said, I'd like to see more of them facing off against the same weapons, the same loadouts, in a game like this, especially the same abilities, I think can be a little bit annoying at times. There's no problem with, say, having a mirror matchup, or maybe there being a couple of the same class on a team, but when you've got something like 4, the game doesn't really end up being all that interesting. So the more class variety, the better. The game does let you switch out dynamically, just like Overwatch, although it's not as useful as it would be in a game like Overwatch. It's like, oh, well, for this specific part of the map, we need to break through, so let's get this class and this class. Well, not really. As I explained before, it really is just a personal preference thing. If you're not doing all that well on a character, maybe switch it up. Maybe if everybody is playing Bombshell and running around with Tesla guns, maybe you all don't want to be assassins because you might end up losing. But I think a scenario like that is going to be fairly rare. Regardless, though, the more weapons, the better. The more loadouts, the better. The more abilities, the better. As far as I am concerned, anyway, that gives the game more variety and more replayability, and I certainly don't see that as a bad thing. That said, when it comes to the existing kits, they are pretty interesting, and they're overall fairly well-rounded and flexible, which is a different design philosophy to other hero shooters where the characters have very specialized. It's nice to always get the option of another weapon. It's nice to get an alt fire. It's nice to get another ability which complements the set and isn't just stuck in a rigid theme or a rigid role. There are no healers or tanks in this game. Everybody's just out to kill the other person. That's kind of refreshing, and it does certainly appeal to my older arena shooter sensibilities. Now, when it comes to things like the ultimates, it brings up a concern that I currently have with the alpha, which is the overall time to kill. Now, I've mentioned several times already in the video that this seems to be a more arena-focused shooter. Certainly not a pure arena shooter by any stretch of the imagination, but it has that in its DNA. So, low time to kill can certainly be a problem in a game like this. And there's one specific example that I'd like to give, which is the ultimate of the character called the Vanguard. The ultimate basically sends her flying into the sky for a couple of seconds, she gets to aim it, and then comes crashing down on top of you in a move that literally breaks gravity, which is a pretty cool mechanic, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The problem with that move is that it's relatively easy to aim, and it does a huge amount of damage. It actually does about 90% of the HP of an assassin. So if you've hit the assassin just a couple of times with a bullet, and then you slam down on them, they're effectively dead. Can you avoid it? Possibly. Now, you can use the grappling hook to try and grapple out of the way, but if you don't have a charge on the grappling hook, since you can only use it a couple of times before it recharges, then you're dead. I mean, there's not really anything you can do about it. By the time you've switched out to your shotgun to try and engage that person in the sky as they slam down on you, well, they've just mashed you into a fine red paste. I don't really like situations like that. I don't like the idea that just because someone has their ultimate charged up, that as soon as I walk into that fight, I'm effectively doomed. It's not a good feeling in a game that seems to emphasize Twitch skill over team synergy. And I think that the solution to that would either be to buff up the HP of everybody somewhat so that, yes, that ultimate could still do damage, but it's not going to be an almost instant kill, especially on the lighter classes. Alternatively, you can tone the ultimates down or give them a longer wind-up time or something like that. That would probably work too, but I think the overall increase in HP would be a good thing, and that leads quite nicely into another concern that I sort of developed while I was playing it. Something that I didn't really notice in the 15 minutes or so that I ended up playing at PAX, but in 2 hours on the same map, sort of playing the same characters and getting a feel for the game, one concern that I had was the ability to get health back. Now, different games do it in different ways. Call of Duty, of course, has the infamous regenerating health, oh god, blood on the screen so real thing. This game doesn't have that, and no doubt that's by deliberate choice. However, when it comes to health regeneration, there are no health packs and there are no healing abilities. In fact, the only way to restore health is to go to a couple of different healing stations on the map and stand in them for a little while to get your HP back. The problem with this approach is that it can leave a character in what I like to call the dead man walking state. Let's say you've just had a 1v1 and you beat them, but you took a bunch of damage in the process. Now, what do you do next? What is your next course of action? What's the next decision that you make as a player? Well, the only logical decision in that position is to go and regenerate that health again. Because if you're sitting on 20, 30 HP, you're probably going to die to a rocket, you're going to die to a Tesla blast, you're going to die to many things, just a couple of bullets. So you're not really in a position to fight. If you encounter somebody else on even half health, you're gonna lose most of the time, unless, of course, you catch them unawares. So that means you have to go to the health station. Well, the question is, where is the health station exactly? And there are only a few of them on the map. There's one or two, I think, inside every person's base, which is where the battery and the generator is held. And then there are two opposite sides of the map on the sort of cliff area. That's kind of it, and it can take quite a while to get there, especially if you're one of the slower characters that doesn't have the really fast movement abilities. If you've taken a bunch of damage as Bombshell, then you're going to be running a good 20-30 seconds at least to try and find a health station, and that's assuming you don't get picked off in the process. The problem with this situation is that you would quite literally be better off committing suicide and respawning. It would be quicker, it would get you back on your feet faster, it would give you full HP once again, which makes you competitive once again and enables you to fight. As a 20 HP person, you can't really contribute to a fight all that much. And the process of running to the health station gives a great deal of downtime in which you are probably not fighting. That sort of defeats the point of the exercise when it comes to a shooter. You want to be in combat as much as possible. That's the core gameplay loop. That's what the game is designed to do in order to entertain you. Running to these health stations is not that entertaining, although it may very well be a little bit tense. There's a reason why other games have health pack drops around the level. Not necessarily allowing you to fully regenerate your health, but allowing you to get some of it back. Since the game has no regenerating health at all, and also doesn't have any sort of health pickup, this huge amount of downtime as well as the dead man walking problem really interrupts the pace of the game and impedes the player's enjoyment. They're not able to get back into the fight quickly. There needs to be some way to do that. Either they could add a small amount of regenerating health. You know, I'm not the world's biggest fan of regenerating health, but I see the purpose of it. You know, maybe allow it to top off to a certain level. Maybe let it regenerate after a reasonable amount of time to 20% HP or 30% HP, but no higher than that. Or alternatively, just simply add health pickups. Not only does this, as far as I'm concerned, add an element of resource gathering, which becomes competitive with other players, but it also encourages learning the map. I don't see any harm with having more traditional medkits and drops. I think that's actually a pretty solid design decision in a game like this. I don't see a reason not to have it, outside of simply trying to change things around for change's sake. The health stations don't really add all that much to the game. They're not an enjoyable element. Reaching them is more of an exercise in tedium more so than anything else. And of course, if somebody comes around the corner, just pops you on, well, you just wasted a bunch of time not fighting, running to a place that you were never realistically going to reach anyway. So I'd like to see that changed. Now, there is an element that I didn't really go in depth on when I talked about this at PAX, and that was the anti-gravity element of the level. So in the middle of this level, there is an area where the gravity is broken. It's part of the overall storyline of the game that somehow the world's gravity got screwed up, Lord knows why. And when you enter this area, you suddenly start to float. And at that point, the combat becomes three-dimensional. That area is required because not only is it the fastest way to traverse the level, because it goes right through the center of it, but it's also where the battery spawns. So you have to fight there for a while, and there's this really cool feeling of basically fighting in space, and it changes things up significantly. It's a whole new way of combat that is a little bit tricky to get used to and really focuses on using your movement-based abilities to manipulate your position and not put yourself in a position where you're very vulnerable just flailing around in the sky, which can certainly help. Doing things like melee in aerial combat is very entertaining. I enjoyed that a lot, and I think it's a great element to add. Not only that, but there's a feature that I was not able to discover during my PAX session, and that's the fact that you can shoot backwards. Not exactly the sort of thing that you would expect out of a first-person shooter, but the shooting backwards, or blind fire as it's called, serves two purposes. Firstly, and most obviously, it lets you fire back on a pursuer. So if you're running away from somebody who's a little bit faster than you, well, you're never going to get away from them. You know, each character has a different speed stat, so you're not going to escape unless you're able to use an escape ability. However, in this situation, it means that you actually can run away from them. You can turn around, and then you can activate blind fire, which is going to fire your weapon behind you. Sure, it's very inaccurate, but it gives you a way to fend off pursuers. Interesting little feature. I've never seen that done in a first-person shooter before. Secondly, and most interestingly perhaps, is that firing backwards actually propels you through the anti-gravity area, using, of course, Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. If the gravity has suddenly been taken away, then firing a projectile is absolutely going to propel you in the opposite direction of said projectile. It acts like a rocket booster of sorts. And as a result, you can use your gun to rapidly traverse these areas or change your height and position while fighting, which is incredibly interesting, and I'd love to see what happens when people really start to learn those techniques and chain them together with the movement abilities like the grappling hook and the jetpack. Using these takes quite a bit of getting used to because it's not usual. It's not the kind of learned skill that you would have gained after playing 20 plus years of FPS, because other FPS simply don't do that. But I'm intrigued to see what can be done with it, especially on levels that have more of these anti-gravity areas. This level we were playing only has one. That said, there is an ability, I believe it's the Vanguard's ability as she crashes down, where she can temporarily break the gravity of an area of the level, which I think is very interesting. I'm hoping that there will be more abilities, or say map-wide events that will do things like that, because I think that the anti-gravity combat is a very interesting part of it that sets it apart from other shooters in the genre, for obvious reasons. Now, as much as I have concerns about the way the health system works and the overall class variety of the game, I have to say that I enjoyed my time with Lawbreakers, and the reason for that is that the weapons felt extremely impactful. Combat felt like it had a real sense of player feedback. There were certain abilities that would just pulp an enemy if they happened to hit them correctly on low HP, not to mention the satisfying oral feedback with splats and huge explosions. It's not all unicorns and roses. For instance, the rifle of the more Call of Duty style character with the aim down sights, although he does have a shoulder mounted rocket launcher that recharges over time, which is pretty cool, felt fairly anemic, something that could certainly be improved. I didn't really like that character all that much, simply because it reminded me a little bit too much of something like Black Ops 3, which is a shame because the shoulder-mounted rocket launcher that could load up to, I think, 4 rockets and lock onto a target was a pretty cool idea, and there's also a mechanic whereby you can increase the recharge speed by picking up ammo from dead enemies. So I enjoyed that aspect of him, I just didn't really like his primary weapon. His secondary weapon, which is a kind of Tesla pistol, was pretty cool, but outside of that, aim-down-sight characters in a game like this aren't really all that appealing to me. I have to say it's nice that there's a class archetype that deals with that, because I imagine that quite a few people that are used to Call of Duty would like to play that particular playstyle, so it's cool to cater to that, it's just not really my thing. Outside of that, most of the weapons feel very satisfying to use, and obviously extremely skill-based. I like the fact that there is quite a lot of movement in this game. Every character has a movement ability of some sort, not to mention the anti-gravity combat makes movement even more important. So, my conclusion on it so far is that Lawbreakers seems to have quite a bit of promise. The final thing to address, I think, would be the business model. It was going to be a free-to-play game, and it's now pay up front. There are, of course, advantages to that. I actually like the pay up front model because it usually means they're not going to lock loadouts and characters behind some sort of microtransaction paywall. That means that everybody's on an equal playing field. Of course, that did not happen with Battleborn, simply because they decided, hey, you bought the game, but you've still got to unlock with in-game stuff anyway. I would love to see that model absolutely die, by the way. I know that companies seem to believe that people feel the need to unlock things and gain progress. I don't agree with that. I think that it might be about time that people start to really rebel against that system. It's annoying. It is disadvantageous to people that don't have as much time as other people. It's doubly disadvantageous because not only do you not have the same stuff as the guy that's played a load, the guy that played a load has had more practice time than you. So not only are they better there, but they're also better in terms of their stats or their weapon loadout or simply their choice of things that they can do. Don't like games that do that. I really don't. I'm getting quite sick of that system. So I like to see any game reject that, and it's much easier to reject it when you have a pay-up-front model as opposed to free-to-play where your options to making a decent amount of money are very, very limited. And don't bring up Valve. For God's sake, don't bring up Valve. Nobody can emulate that, or at least not without a significant amount of effort. They don't have the infrastructure to do it, not to mention that those games were basically built in their free-to-play model as loss leaders, because the Steam platform makes so much money and it's more valuable to bring more people to the platform. That's where Valve makes its money, not those games. They could lose money hand over fist and Valve wouldn't bat an eye. As it turns out, they don't, but hey. There is also the advantage that pay-up-front models tend to reduce the amount of hackers in the game, which is always a good thing. However, the disadvantage of that, of course, is that it can limit the overall size of the player base, and you can enter what's called the death spiral if you don't have enough players, which results in slower matchmaking and, perhaps more importantly, more inaccurate matchmaking, where you're matched up with people who are either far better or far worse than you, simply because there aren't enough players around the same MMR to fill up a game. It's not that you'll never get a game. It's very rare to find a multiplayer game where it's impossible to get a game of any description. Not to mention the fact that you could simply ask your friends to play with you. But there are definitely problems when a player base starts to decline. We see it in games like Titanfall, where newer players are faced with people that not only have everything unlocked, but are very, very well practiced at the game, so they end up getting slapped about a little bit too much. It's not that you can't get a game of Titanfall, it's more difficult to get a balanced game of Titanfall as a result of the reduced population. So it's a little bit risky, but I have to say I do prefer it, especially when you bear in mind that the publisher for this is Nexon, who have something of a history of having free-to-play models that are not necessarily fair and balanced. So this cuts quite a lot of that out of the equation as far as I'm concerned. So I want to see what the other game modes are and what the other maps are and what they have in terms of either loadouts or new characters. I'd like to see more variety there. But I think that Lawbreakers is a solid foundation. It's got some interesting ideas that haven't been done in FPS before. It feels more arena-centric. It feels more Twitch-based. It feels more individually competitive than a game like Overwatch. And that, I think, gives it a unique place in the market at the moment, while still incorporating some of the cool elements that people like from games like Overwatch and, of course, Dota and League of Legends. The weapons feel pretty great, the movement system is interesting, and there are some really cool moments. Like this one, for instance. Where the bloody hell did you go? You went over there. Oh god! No! Yeah! Yes! He fell to his death! What a fucking save! Ladies and gentlemen, there we go. There are my thoughts currently on Lawbreakers Alpha. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, by all means do feel free to click that like button if you did not. The dislike button is right over there, and I will see you next time.